Late at night, under a silent sky, a lonely cowboy made a decision that would change his fate forever when he saw a starving native child collapse near his barn. The child's lips were cracked, his body shaking, and his eyes held more fear than anger. The cowboy knew helping him could bring danger, yet turning away would mean death. With a heavy heart, he chose mercy over fear and carried the child inside, feeding him with the last food he had. All night, the wind howled as the cowboy stayed awake, wondering if kindness would cost him his life. He believed the night would end quietly, like all the others before it. But as dawn broke and golden light touched the land, an uneasy silence filled the air. When the barn door creaked open, his breath stopped. Outside stood 200 native warriors, watching him without a word. And in that frozen moment, the cowboy realized this was no ordinary morning, and his simple act of kindness had awakened a powerful destiny. The story follows a humble cowboy who lives alone on a rough stretch of land near the edge of native territory, where silence is broken only by wind and distant howls. He is a quiet man shaped by hardship, keeping his head down and his heart guarded after years of loss. Trouble has passed through these lands before, so he avoids it, believing peace comes from staying invisible. His days are filled with simple work, his nights with long shadows and lonely thoughts. There is no family waiting for him, no voice calling his name, only the barn, the horses, and the cold stars above. Life is simple but unforgiving, and survival depends on caution, not courage. He believes fate has forgotten him, leaving him to fade quietly into the land. But on one cruel night, when the wind cuts deeper than usual, fate finally finds him, bringing a dying child to his door and forcing the cowboy to face a choice that will shatter his quiet world forever. The wind howled harder as the night deepened, and just as the cowboy turned toward his barn to escape the cold, a faint sound stopped him, a dragging step barely louder than the snow beneath it, forcing him to listen again with his heart pounding. He moved slowly toward the noise, senses sharp, knowing this land punished mistakes without mercy, and there he saw it. A small figure collapsed near the fence, barely moving, almost swallowed by the darkness. As he knelt closer, the truth struck him with painful force. A native child lay trembling, skin pale, breath shallow, ribs visible through torn clothing stiff with ice. The cowboy hesitated, fear tightening his chest, because helping this child could mark him as an enemy, could invite retaliation, could bring armed men to his door before sunrise. He had heard stories, warnings whispered by travelers, lessons carved into survival, yet leaving the child there meant certain death, slow and silent, claimed by the cold. The child's eyes fluttered open for a moment, filled not with hatred but exhaustion, and that look broke something inside the cowboy that years of loneliness had hardened. He lifted the child carefully, surprised by how light the body felt, and carried him toward the barn, every step heavy with doubt and resolve. Inside, the warmth was weak but real, and he wrapped the child in a blanket meant for his horse, sharing what little heat he could offer. He melted snow for water, fed him slowly with the last scraps of food he had saved for winter, watching each breath as if it might be the last. Hours passed while the storm raged outside, and sleep never came to the cowboy as he sat beside the child, listening to the wind and wondering if kindness was about to cost him everything he owned, including his life. Memories of past warnings echoed in his mind, reminding him that mercy was rarely repaid in safe ways on this land. Still, he stayed, adjusting the blanket, whispering calm words the child barely heard, choosing hope over fear with every passing minute. As the child's breathing steadied, the cowboy felt relief mixed with dread, because saving a life did not erase consequences, it only delayed them. When the fire burned low and the sky slowly shifted from black to gray, a deep silence replaced the storm, pressing against the walls like a held breath. The cowboy rose carefully and walked to the barn door, his heart heavy, knowing dawn would bring answers he could not escape. And as he reached for the handle, he understood that the moment he chose mercy, his quiet life had already ended, whether he survived the morning or not. His hand rested on the cold handle for a long moment before he turned back inside, choosing silence instead of panic, because fear would not help the child survive the fragile hours ahead. He added another piece of wood to the fire, watching weak flames stretch upward as if struggling just like the small body on the floor. The cowboy sat close, offering warmth with his own presence, aware that every sound outside could mean discovery, yet refusing to abandon the responsibility he had accepted. He checked the child's pulse often, slow but steady, and spoke softly to keep him anchored to the world, even though the words were meant more for himself than for the fading ears listening. Time moved strangely, stretching each minute into something heavy, and the darkness outside pressed against the walls as if testing his resolve. He stayed awake through it all, eyes burning, thoughts drifting between regret and purpose, knowing that mercy once chosen could not be undone. The child stirred, coughed, then settled, and the cowboy felt a cautious hope rise, fragile as glass, because survival was never guaranteed here. He rationed his food carefully, breaking pieces smaller than he wanted, balancing care with scarcity, understanding that generosity without wisdom could end both lives. When exhaustion tried to pull him down, he resisted, pacing the barn, listening for distant movement, preparing himself for whatever dawn might bring. He imagined footsteps, imagined voices, imagined weapons, yet none came, only the steady breathing beside him reminding him why he remained. In the quiet, he realized how long it had been since his choices mattered to anyone else, and that realization brought both comfort and fear. The fire crackled low, and he fed it again, guarding the warmth like a promise he refused to break. Outside, the sky slowly lightened, and the world felt suspended, waiting to judge him. He knew this act of kindness had been done without witnesses, without praise, and without protection, which made it pure but dangerous. As pale light slipped through the cracks in the barn walls, his heart tightened, because consequences always arrived with the morning. He placed a steady hand on the child's shoulder, grounding himself, accepting that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to stand anyway. Whatever came next would come because of this night, because of this choice. And as the sun prepared to rise, the cowboy understood that saving one life had already changed his own in ways he could never measure. The door opened with a slow creak, and as the cowboy stepped into the pale morning light, his body locked in place, breath caught, heart pounding so loudly it felt exposed, because the land in front of him was no longer empty. Rows of native warriors stood across the snow-covered ground, stretching farther than his eyes could quickly count, silent and unmoving like carved stone. Their presence pressed the air tight, and even the wind seemed afraid to pass between them. Spears, bows, and blades were visible but held low, not raised, yet the threat hung heavy, unmistakable, waiting. The cowboy did not reach for a weapon, knowing any sudden movement could end everything before a word was spoken. His thoughts raced, calculating distance, escape, and failure, but every path led to the same ending. He felt small, exposed, and painfully aware of the barn behind him, where a fragile life rested depending on what happened next. The warriors did not speak, and that silence frightened him more than shouting ever could. He stood straight despite the fear, because bending now would change nothing, and he refused to let terror be the last thing that defined him. Sunlight crept higher, touching faces lined with strength and discipline, eyes watching him with unreadable focus. The cowboy searched for anger and found none, only control, which made the moment feel heavier. A single step forward from him felt impossible, and stepping back felt like surrender, so he stayed exactly where he was, balanced between fate and consequence. His hands trembled slightly, yet he kept them visible, showing he carried no threat. Every story he had ever heard about this land echoed in his mind, warnings born from fear and misunderstanding, and he realized how easily those stories had shaped his expectations. The warriors remained still, as if waiting for something unseen, and the waiting stretched time thin. The cowboy swallowed, feeling the weight of his choice from the night before settled fully on his shoulders. He understood now that mercy never stayed small, that it traveled farther than fear, reaching places a man could not predict. The barn behind him felt suddenly like a line drawn in the dirt, separating past and future. His muscles ached from the long night, and exhaustion blurred the edges of thought, but clarity cut through the fear with quiet strength. If this was the end, he would face it standing, not running, not begging, because the choice he made had been honest. A breeze finally moved through the space between them, carrying the smell of smoke and earth, and the warriors did not react, holding their formation with disciplined calm. The cowboy lifted his chin slightly, meeting the moment without words, accepting that this sunrise carried judgment, and in that frozen stillness, he believed with complete certainty that his life, as he had known it, was already over. A single figure finally moved from the silent line, stepping forward with calm authority, and the warriors behind him parted just enough to let him pass, their discipline unbroken. The man's presence carried weight without threat, and when he stopped a short distance away, the tension shifted, no longer sharp but heavy with meaning. His eyes fixed on the cowboy, then briefly toward the barn, and in that glance something deep and personal surfaced. He spoke slowly, voice steady, explaining that a child had been lost during a brutal journey through the cold, separated from his people when the storm turned cruel. Searchers had followed faint signs through the night, driven by fear that hope would fade with every frozen mile. When the chief said the child was his son, the words landed softly yet powerfully, reshaping the air between them. The cowboy felt his chest tighten as understanding replaced dread, and the silence no longer felt like judgment but restraint. The chief continued, saying that many would have turned away, many would have chosen safety over compassion, yet this stranger had opened his door without knowing who the child was or what price kindness might demand. The warriors had not gathered in anger, but in gratitude, bound by honor to stand witness to mercy. As the chief spoke, he lowered his head slightly, a gesture that carried more meaning than any shouted praise. The cowboy struggled to steady himself, unprepared for respect where he had expected destruction. He realized the weapons he had feared were symbols of protection, not punishment, carried by men who valued restraint as much as strength. The chief explained that the land remembered actions, that kindness traveled faster than violence, and that the warriors had come to see the man who chose life over fear. A subtle signal passed through the formation, and the warriors shifted their stance, no longer rigid, but grounded, acknowledging the moment without celebration. The cowboy felt a quiet warmth rise behind his eyes, not pride, but relief mixed with humility, because he had not acted for reward. He had simply refused to let a child die alone. The chief thanked him without excess words, promising that such mercy would not be forgotten, that paths would remain open where they once felt dangerous. In that exchange, something ancient and human connected them, father to protector, bound by a night that could never be undone. The barn no longer felt like a trap behind the cowboy, but a shelter that had served its purpose. He stood listening, absorbing the truth that courage could invite peace instead of conflict. As the chief finished speaking, the silence returned, but it was no longer threatening, it was respectful, carrying the weight of shared understanding. In that moment, the cowboy knew the morning had not brought an ending, but a transformation, and the fear that once ruled the land around him quietly released its grip. The chief raised his hand slowly, and at that simple motion, the line of warriors responded together, lowering their heads in unison, a powerful gesture that carried respect instead of threat, turning the frozen ground into a place of understanding. The cowboy felt his knees weaken for a moment, not from fear now, but from the weight of what he was witnessing, because violence had been expected, even accepted, yet honor had arrived instead. The chief spoke again, his words calm and clear, promising that no harm would come to this place, that the land around the barn would be watched not as enemy ground, but as protected soil. He explained that a life saved created a bond stronger than bloodshed, and that protection was owed where mercy had been given without condition. As the warriors lifted their heads, their expressions remained serious, but the tension that once pressed the air began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. The cowboy listened, barely breathing, realizing how close he had come to misjudging everything he feared. He had believed strength lived only in weapons and numbers, yet here it stood in discipline and restraint. The chief described how fear had shaped many paths into conflict, how suspicion turned neighbors into enemies before a word was spoken, and how this single act of kindness had broken that pattern. The cowboy felt something settle deep within him, a truth he had never learned through hardship alone, that peace required courage greater than violence ever demanded. He glanced briefly toward the barn, thinking of the small life still resting inside. and understood that the knight's choice had reached far beyond survival. The warriors shifted their stance again, no longer a wall but a presence, guardians rather than judges, and the land itself seemed to breathe easier. The chief assured him that travelers would know this place as one of safety, not danger, and that any who threatened it would answer to the promise made this morning. The cowboy nodded slowly, words failing him, because gratitude felt too small compared to what had been offered. He stood straighter, not from pride, but from clarity, realizing he no longer stood alone against the world. The silence that followed was not empty but full, carrying respect between men who understood loss, responsibility, and choice. In that stillness, the cowboy recognized how fear had kept him isolated for years, convincing him survival meant distance, yet kindness had built connection in a single night. As the sun climbed higher, light washed over the gathered figures, and the moment etched itself into memory, a turning point where bloodshed was refused and dignity prevailed. The cowboy watched as the warriors prepared to depart, knowing they would leave without celebration or demand, because honor did not require applause. And as they turned away, he finally understood that mercy was not weakness, but the rarest form of strength, capable of reshaping land, lives, and futures without spilling a single drop of blood. The warriors turned away and left as quietly as they had come, their footsteps fading into the land as if the moment had been a vision, not reality. The cowboy remained standing in the morning light, the wind brushing past him, the barn behind him calm and safe, and for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. Nothing around him looked different, yet everything had changed forever. Fear no longer ruled his days, because respect now walked beside him like a silent guard. He returned inside, checked on the sleeping child, and felt a peace deeper than words, knowing one life saved had reshaped many others. He did not seek praise, nor did he call himself brave, but the land would remember what he had done. Stories would travel where he never would, carried by voices and time. A simple man had chosen compassion in the darkest hour, and that single choice transformed him into a legend whose kindness would outlive his footsteps and echo long after he was gone.